Perfect. So as a few of you have joined already, I don't want to keep you waiting too much. So thanks for registering for our third Snowplow webinar, where Yali will be deep diving into all things ITP 2.1, ad blockers, and kind of some of our views on this, and why we think Snowplow is a really great tool that has a lot of advantages to help you navigate this ever complex, like increasingly complex environment of web analytics. So if you've got any questions throughout, there's a chat box. There's also a Q&A thing at the bottom. You can also raise your hand, and I'll be able to see that you have a question, and I'll be able to make sure that you can ask that. So we've got some slides to go through, but this is like, there's a lot of kind of subtleties and questions that you have. So we're really keen for this to be a discussion as well. And likely if you have a question, it's probably a similar question for somebody else at a different organization. So please do ask. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Yali and let him get to the interesting part of this.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So I'm just going to share my screen and bring up the slides. So hopefully you can see them all. So I'm just going to be running through the impact that ad blockers and ITP are having on our on Snowplow users, and talk through some of the different strategies that you guys, our customers, can take to ensuring as reliable as possible tracking of web events in this environment where that tracking is becoming harder and harder. So just to start off with a bit of context, tracking users browsing the web is becoming harder and harder all the time. So three things that we see going on here are new regulations. The one that's caused the most recent stir is GDPR, but they're GDPR light regulations that have been launched in California, and other jurisdictions are following suit. The rise of ad blockers. Ad blockers have become very prevalent technologies. And the third category of kind of obstacles to web tracking that we see emerging are measures taken in the browser by the browser owners themselves, notably Safari and Firefox. And in Safari's case, those measures come under the ITP, sort of intelligent tracking, tracking prevention initiative. So what we're seeing broadly as an industry is a shift towards giving people more control, giving consumers more control over who is collecting data from them, and really seeing the pendulum shift pretty far from one extreme to another extreme. So for a very long time, and it's easy to forget this today, the web was really a wild west where anybody could come along and start collecting data from just about any website that they wanted. The only barrier to entry was really persuading website owners to load some of their code. And what we found, what happened was that website owners as a group were pretty easily persuaded to load other people's code. So you want to work with a particular marketing supplier, they provide a tracking pixel, you have to load that. So people, website owners were very strongly encouraged to load marketing pixels, analytics tags, tag managers. And one of the difficulties when you're loading, when you're adding these tracking snippets to your website is, as a site owner, you don't necessarily have a huge amount of visibility and control into what data the owners of those tracking pixels and tags are collecting, and then what's happening to that data once it's being collected. And if you as a website owner don't have that visibility, then you can be very sure that the consumers whose data is being taken have very limited visibility, leave alone control over what data is collected and how that data is used. And it's in the context of that Wild West that really the digital advertising industry evolved. And in that industry, you have all kinds of third parties that were collecting data that really had no direct relationship with the users that were collecting that data. So we've moved from an industry which was very, where the pendulum was very, very far in favor of anybody being able to come along and collect data. And now really the pendulum has swung pretty strongly in the other direction, in terms of there are now a number of different actors, including the ad block providers and the browsers and the government regulators, that are trying to rein in the situation and rebalance things in favor of consumers and away from companies collecting the data, so data controllers. So at Snowplow, we've got our own view about what constitutes fair and unfair tracking. I think it's important to say really early on that we think that they're legitimate and actually really powerful reasons for tracking. And it's important to distinguish the two, because we want to do our best to encourage fair tracking. So our view is that, you know, the difference between fair and unfair tracking is all about the visibility that's given to those users whose data is collected. If you as a visitor to a website, know who is collecting the data, what data they're collecting, why they're collecting that data, how that data is being used, and you've got a clear set of controls over enabling that data collection, then that feels very fair. And whereas if you don't have that visibility and you don't have those controls as a consumer, that feels very unfair. And so when we think about that shift in the industry, moving from an industry where there were very, very many providers doing unfair tracking, and you know, there were companies doing fair tracking in and amongst them, but there's a lot of unfair tracking, and that's what's driven this shift in the industry. What I think is really striking is that website owners, I'm sure a number of you on this call are site owners, can only really do fair tracking if you're very clear about what the third parties that you're loading on your websites are collecting, why, and what they're doing with that data, which historically hasn't always been information that's easy to get. So we believe that there's fair and unfair tracking, but not only that, we believe there are enormous benefits to both companies and consumers in fair tracking. So where companies are tracking and using the data productively, they should be creating environments where their consumers benefit and they benefit in tandem. So where companies better use that data to better understand their customers, they're in better position to serve them, surprise them, and delight them, and that should provide for better outcomes for those companies and their customers. So we strongly believe that businesses that do this well can use this to drive real competitive advantage. And at Snowplow, that's what encourages us to get up in the morning and build tech and win customers and encourage fair and productive use of data. One of the observations that I think is interesting, and I'll come back to later on in the presentation, is that whilst website owners are in a position to do fair and productive tracking, actually many third parties are also in a position to do fair and productive tracking. And that's important because I think a number of commentators and players in the space often equate third-party tracking with unfair tracking and first-party tracking with fair tracking, and I don't think that that's right at all. I think there are first and third-party parties that are doing tracking fairly, and there are first and third parties that are doing tracking unfairly. So I think that's a simplification that we don't want to make, but I'll come back to that in due course. So let's start by talking about ad blockers, and we'll come on to ITP and ITP 2.1 in particular in a little bit. So ad blockers, I'm sure you're all aware, but just very quick recap, are browser plugins that prevent a couple of things. They prevent the flow of data from the browser to the advertiser, so the sort of harvesting of data by the advertiser, and they prevent the serving of ads back into the browser. So they're interfering with the flow of data in one direction, the flow of advertising in another direction in the browser. Ad blockers are becoming very, very prevalent. They're not a niche technology anymore used by a group of particularly nerdy developers when they're browsing the internet. They're really They're really becoming quite commonplace. A subset of ad blockers block analytics tracking as well. And this is in some ways very, very surprising. It's not obvious or clear why an ad blocker would block data tracking. I mean, some of the data might be tracked for reasons of advertising, but there are many other reasons for doing analytics tracking that have nothing to do with advertising. So I think that's a pretty surprising move by some of the ad block providers out there. And a number of those block Snowplow tracking. So they also block Google Analytics tracking and other analytics vendors, but Snowplow tracking is blocked by a subset of those ad blockers. And as a result of this, more and more of our users have asked us to roll out features to make it harder for ad blockers to interfere with Snowplow data collection. And I'll be talking about a couple of those features that we have planned in due course. So our position on ad blockers is that ad blockers are incredibly blunt instruments to give consumers control of their own data. When you install an ad blocker, what you're effectively doing as a consumer is you're giving the author of the ad blocker control over who can and can't collect data. So ad block is for us, it's not putting power in the right hands, which is in the hands of consumers. We believe that the best outcomes are secured for consumers when they can have honest conversations with the companies that want to collect their data. So when companies go and collect data without having those conversations, we think that that's unfair tracking, and that's not best practice. Ad blockers are not a solution to that. Ad blockers enable consumers to block tracking without having those conversations, which we think is bad for companies, obviously, that want to collect data, but ultimately for consumers as well, because they're circumventing those conversations. And so we're not surprised that many of our users are really frustrated that ad blockers are going after Snowplow data collection. And it's become a priority for us to empower our users to with new features to make it harder for those ad blockers to block Snowplow data collection, because there are many Snowplow users who are doing fair data collection, and it's bluntly what the ad blockers are doing by blocking that is unfair. So it's incumbent on us to help you guys work around that. And the main feature that we've got planned to help prevent ad blockers blocking Snowplow tracking is enabling our users to define custom page paths. So just to explain what this is and give a bit of context, ad blockers that block analytics tracking in general and Snowplow JavaScript tracking in particular do this blocking in two ways. So the first thing that they do is they try and prevent the Snowplow JavaScript, so whatever the analytics JavaScript SDK from loading. And they can do this by, in Snowplow's case, I think what some of them have tried in the past is blocking the loading of any file called sp.js from CloudFront, which is how many Snowplow users loaded their Snowplow JavaScript historically. So one way you can stop tracking is by preventing the SDK from loading. The second route is to block the actual HTTP requests that are made by the SDK. Those HTTP requests being the device that the SDK is using to send the data into the Snowplow pipeline, so to the Snowplow collector, where it'll then get picked up and processed and loaded to the data warehouse. So that's how the ad blockers work, and there are a number of measures that companies can take to make sure that the sp.js, the Snowplow JavaScript, loads successfully. And the simplest one, and we've been working with our customers to do this for quite a long time now, is simply renaming the Snowplow JavaScript file to a randomly generated file name, so that the ad blockers can't spot its Snowplow JavaScript. I think we've had some users who've gone further and even build the Snowplow JavaScript into their own JavaScript. So you sort of it's completely integrated in our client's own JavaScript. But I think the vast majority of our, at least our paying customers, simply rename the Snowplow JavaScript, and that works pretty nicely. However, that doesn't help with the second approach that the ad blockers take to blocking the actual requests that are made from the Snowplow JavaScript. And what's interesting about this is, for most analytics vendors, the ad blockers work by spotting the URL that the requests are going to, recognizing if a URL is an analytics provider, and then blocking the requests. With Snowplow, because every company running Snowplow has their collector on a different URL, that approach hasn't been possible. So what the ad blockers do is they do a regex on the request itself, and they block requests with the path com.snowplowanalytics.snowplow/tp2, which is the path on the collector that data is posted to if you've got your JavaScript tracker set up to post the data to your collector. And so that's the primary way that these requests are spotted by the ad blockers. And the idea there is simply to enable each of our users to define their own page path. So you'll be able to configure your Snowplow pipeline to accept requests from your JavaScript tracker on any path you choose. So it can be /com.mycompany or anything else. You might just pick a random path, and then you'll configure your JavaScript tracker to send data to that path. And then, because every different Snowplow user in the world will be sending data to a different path, that will no longer be a way that ad blockers can use to recognize HTTP requests generated by Snowplow trackers and block those requests. I hope I've explained that reasonably clearly. If I haven't, please do ask a question, and we can go into that in more detail. I can try and explain it again. So not a particularly sexy piece of functionality, but we think it'll be pretty effective in preventing ad blockers. I hope it will prevent them from blocking Snowplow requests altogether, but my expectation is that enterprising ad block developer will find another way to spot our requests, and we'll end up engaging in a bit of an arms race. But let's see what happens. So turning our attention away from AdBlock to ITP and ITP 2.1 in particular. So the creators of Firefox and Safari are taking more and more steps to protect their users, to give their users more protection over what data is collected and limit tracking. Safari in particular are doing a lot with ITP, so intelligent tracking prevention. Safari are specifically targeting third-party tracking, so putting in place measures to stop third parties collecting data, notably Facebook, from users across multiple domains. So I think these were the browsers that first gave users options to easily block all third-party cookies. So when we started Snowplow, it was pretty common for third-party cookies to be pretty reliable. These days, that's not the case. Many users block the setting of third-party cookies by default, and I think it was Firefox, if I remember correctly, that was the first browser to really make that a straightforward thing to do. With the first version of ITP that the guys at Apple launched, the impact of that was to block by default the setting of third-party cookies from domains where users hadn't meaningfully interacted. So if you were an ad network, for example, and you were tracking users across multiple domains, if the guys at Safari spotted that you were setting cookies on a user's browser, but a user hadn't actually visited the domain on which you were setting those cookies from, they would deem that you didn't have a meaningful relationship with those users, and therefore those cookies would get blocked. So that was rolled out quite a while ago. With the latest version of ITP, so all the way forward through to 2.1, they've gone quite a lot further, and they've blocked first-party cookies used from a third-party context. So I'll go into what that means in sort of general and for Snowplow users specifically on the next slide. But just to come back to that point earlier, what we're really seeing is the guys at Safari really treating third-party tracking as evil and first-party tracking as okay. And I think that's a pretty objectionable stance that they've taken, because there are good third parties doing fair tracking, just as there are first parties doing unfair tracking. So our view on the measures taken by the browser makers, by Safari and by Firefox, are that on the one hand, these measures are more sophisticated and less blunt than the ad blockers. The browsers are creating functionality that in some cases is giving users a lot more control. It's giving users visibility over who's collecting their data, and pretty fine-grained controls over whose cookies they will allow and whose they won't. And there is a kind of a logic to putting in place more measures to prevent third-party tracking in a world where third-party tracking is more likely to be unfair and first-party tracking is more likely to be fair. But that is still really, really blunt. There are unfair first-party trackers, and there are very, very fair third-party data collectors. So our view is that these measures are also really blunt. And I think the really telling thing about ITP 2.1 is that whilst Apple appear to be targeting Facebook and other Facebook with this move, the collateral damage is pretty enormous. I mean, just about anyone doing any kind of web analytics will be affected by ITP, or has already been affected by ITP 2.1. These changes have been rolling out for a while, and so the collateral damage that's been created by this move is pretty enormous. So taking that context and putting it to one side, let's dive into what you guys are probably most interested in, which is what is ITP 2.1 and how does it affect us, and what should we do about it? So to get very, very clear on that, with ITP 2.1, first-party cookies that are set by JavaScript are removed after 7 days. So this is pretty big, because most web analytics tools identify users by first-party cookies that are set via JavaScript, and those cookies would typically be used to do attribution. So if you've driven someone to your site and then 30 days later they purchase, the cookie that's set when they first drove to your site is what you're using to identify that this user was originally acquired on this advertising channel. That would no longer be possible, because that cookie would expire after 7 days. What that means is that if a user visits your website in Safari and returns after 3 days, she will still have the same domain user ID value. So in Snowplow land, the first-party cookie that is set by JavaScript is the value that's used in the domain user ID. So if a user comes to your site on Safari, returns after 3 days, that's within the 7-day window, they'll still have the same domain. She will still have the same domain user ID. If, however, she leaves and returns after 8 days, that cookie will have been deleted, and so she'll have a new domain user ID and will appear to be a new rather than a returning user. So this is the issue that's been introduced with ITP 2.1. Worth noting, this same effect will impact Google Analytics users, segment users, all the different analytics packages that are out there that rely on first-party cookies that are set from JavaScript. And this is really important for any companies that are looking to understand user behavior over an extended period of time, where the gaps in activity for those users are likely to last more than 7 days. And that's pretty common. So if you are a newspaper site, it might be likely that the vast majority of your users are logging in daily or multiple times a week, and you won't be that affected. But for many types of services, websites, the gap between users visiting the website might be much longer than 7 days, and so resetting a user's cookie after just 7, or clearing the user's cookie after 7 days is is going to have a very, very significant impact. The good news as Snowplow users is you already have a number of options for handling this, and I'm going to run through the 3 of these. So the first is to use cookies set server-side by the collector, i.e. the network user ID as the primary anonymous user identifier, rather than the domain user ID. The second approach is to use local storage rather than cookies to store state for the JavaScript tracker. And the third, which isn't really a solution to this problem, but is an interesting thing to think about in this context, is to do more server-side tracking. So I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail. So Snowplow has Snowplow's always had 2 identifiers for users that are available in a web environment: the domain user ID that is set directly by the JavaScript, and the network user ID that is set by the collector. Now, when we introduced the network user ID, it was years and years ago. I can't remember how long ago it was. The idea was that that was a third-party cookie that companies could use to track users across multiple different domains. So we introduced that in a different world where it wasn't very common for users to block third-party cookies. And what's happened since is, as more and more users have blocked third-party cookies, the network user ID is a value that's used by fewer and fewer of our users, and more of them have come to rely on the domain user ID as the primary way of identifying anonymous users on their website. Now, what's interesting is that if the collector is configured to set the network user ID on the same top-level domain as the website being tracked, then the cookie is treated as a first-party cookie ID rather than a third-party cookie ID. So if I'm running my collector on collector.mysite.com, I can configure my collector to set cookies on .mysite.com, and then when I'm doing tracking on www.mysite.com, that network cookie is actually a first-party cookie. The important thing from an ITP 2.1 perspective is that first-party cookie is set server-side by the collector. Because it's set server-side, not client-side by the JavaScript tracker, it is not subject to ITP 2.1. So that cookie can be set. I think it's got a default expiration of 365 days, and Safari won't clear it after 7 days. So that cookie in an ITP 2.1 world is more reliable than the domain user ID cookie. And our recommendation to users is to use that as the primary anonymous user identifier rather than the domain user ID because of these changes that Apple have introduced with ITP 2.1. Again, I'm trying to explain this as clearly as possible, but if I'm skipping things, I'm running over things too quickly, or there are edge cases you want to discuss, then please note them down. I'm planning on leaving plenty of time to discuss them at the end of the presentation. So that approach of using the network user ID rather than domain user ID should work really well for companies that want to track on a single domain where their collector is hosted on the same domain as the website that they're tracking. However, we do have a number of users that need to track users across multiple different domains. So there might be, media companies that have a number of different brands. And the idea here is to extend the Snowplow collector so that it supports setting cookies on multiple top-level domains. So the collector would check on what website the user is on, and based on that, set the cookie on the appropriate domain. And this would enable users doing that multiple domain tracking to do that successfully using the network user ID. And this work is scheduled to be delivered in the next 3 months. So we're currently jiggling around our engineering roadmap to see if we can bring that forwards. But that is where it's scheduled at the moment. So we should have a good solution for companies tracking across multiple domains in the near future. The second approach, which is open to our users, is to use an option in the JavaScript tracker to use local storage rather than cookies to store the domain user ID value. So the Snowplow JavaScript tracker has this option when you're initializing it to set the state storage strategy. So you as a Snowplow user can say, I want to store state on a cookie, or I want to store state in local storage. This was a feature that we rolled out quite a while ago in the JavaScript tracker, long before ITP 2.1 came along, really to help. We had a few customers that had concerns about the number of cookies that they were setting and wanted to look at. Wanted to reduce their cookie footprint and asked us to add this ability to use local storage instead. If you set up the JavaScript tracker to use local storage instead, then because the values stored in local storage aren't cleared after 7 days by ITP 2.1, it's just the cookies that are clear, the problem kind of goes away. So user visits your website, she's assigned a domain user ID, she leaves and comes back 10 days later, the old domain user ID is read off of local storage and recorded against any new events recorded for that user. So local storage sort of makes the domain user ID value reliable again. It means you can be confident that value will persist beyond 7 days. The big limitation with this approach is that the value that you set isn't available across different subdomains. So if you've got a website with multiple different subdomains, and in the example given on the slide, you've got a blog on blog.mysite.com and the main site on www.mysite.com, then whereas with a cookie, you can set a cookie on the top level domain, so .mysite.com, and it will be available on both subdomains. So it'll be easy to see your user moving across your blog and your website. If you switch to using local storage, that will no longer be possible. Local storage is tied to the full domain. So this is a nice strategy for companies that are tracking users on websites where there is a single subdomain. That this is a strategy that won't work if you want to track users across different subdomains. I've just seen there's something's come up in the chat. It's Gabor. Local storage also requires the protocol to be the same, e.g. if your website allows HTTP traffic but checkout is HTTPS only, local storage will not persist across the pages even if the subdomain is the same. I hadn't appreciated that, Gabor. So thanks for flagging that. I'd assumed if it was set on HTTPS, if it'd been set on HTTPS, it would only be accessible in HTTPS. But if it'd been set on HTTP, it'd be accessible in HTTPS. But so that's really helpful to understand. So that's another really important limitation with using local storage. There are a number of hacks and I'll share links to these to get the local storage solution working across subdomains. But fundamentally, the solution I think that we want to encourage most Snowplow users to work towards is to use the network user ID. I think for those subset of users who've maybe got websites that are HTTP or HTTPS only and only a single subdomain, I think the local storage option is a pretty good one. But for everybody else, I think the network user ID is probably the better solution. The final thing that I want to mention, I'll only mention it briefly because it's not really a solution to this problem. It's just something that's kind of relevant in this, that's vaguely relevant in this context. So one of the things that we've seen at Snowplow is a growth in the number of companies that are doing server-side tracking. So companies that are doing web tracking tend to default to doing that client-side, and there are good reasons for tracking events, primarily client-side. But there are also good reasons to do to track events server-side as well, and some of these relate to things like ad block and ITP. So whilst if you think about all the different events that you want to track from a user when they're on your site, a number of them won't involve hitting a server. So any kind of AJAX event, any kind of loading content from CDNs, you have to track. If you want to record those events, you have to record them client side. You have to rely on things like JavaScript, and you're susceptible to things in the browser interfering with that tracking. But for many of the highest value events, so where a user's logging into your service or registering or transacting or posting a message, that event will at some point hit your servers, and there's an opportunity therefore to track those events server-side. Server-side tracking is not impacted by ad blockers or browser measures because that tracking is happening in an environment that you control absolutely. So where there are opportunities to track things server-side, we highly recommend setting that up, not as an alternative to client-side tracking, but alongside it. So you've effectively got a more robust data collection. The reason why I wasn't sure whether to include it in this presentation is it doesn't actually solve the problem of reliably identifying anonymous users. So when you're recording events server-side, you still want to record it with the domain user ID and the network user ID value, so you can stitch those events to the events that you've collected client-side. And so you still need at least one of those two identifiers to be reliably set if the stitch is going to be successful. For any kind of logged in user, hopefully you've got the user's login. You've got a more reliable user identifier that you can use to do that stitch. So if you've got users who are blocking client-side tracking, server-side tracking won't enable you to figure out who they are, but they might at least give you a sense of, hey, we've got all these users who are on our website and are doing things, and we can see that because we can see the server-side data, and we've got no client-side data to marry them to. So we can start to maybe estimate the size of the black spot created by users who, for one reason or another, have blocked our tracking.
We've got a question coming, Yali.
Oh, brilliant!
So I'll read it out. I'm not sure if everyone can see the Q&A, and I've also already managed to press the wrong button. So the question is, what are your thoughts on tracking evolving away from cookies altogether? Apple Mac OS recently introduced an identifier for advertising similar to the mobile device identifier on iOS devices. Is it only a matter of time before browsers give JavaScript access to the identifier for advertising?
It's a really interesting development. It's a really interesting development. It's worked pretty well on mobile, and I think it's got a lot of potential on the web. There is a huge amount of power and value in being the owner of that identifier, and the arbiter of who can and who can't access that identifier. So I'm not surprised that Apple is is making moves in that direction, and I wouldn't be surprised if Facebook and others sort of follow suit. So I think it'd be a really interesting trend to watch. I think it's a little bit of a shame. It would be a shame if we ended up living in a world where one of those big multinational companies ended up being the arbiter of who could reliably identify, of which companies could reliably identify who. It would be nicer to live in a world where each business could have that conversation and win the trust of their users directly. But maybe that's a drum that I need to stop banging and get over myself. I don't know. It's a great question. It'll be really interesting to watch. Cool. So just to summarize, and then hopefully we can dive into that and more questions. So there are already a number of options that the companies running Snowplow have to help mitigate the impact of ITP and Ad Block. So expanded use of the network user ID is number one. Potentially using domain user ID with local storage, if that's applicable in your use case, and increasing use of server-side tracking. We've got more functionality in the works to help with to help manage both these things. So the big thing on the ad block side is support for custom page paths and support for setting the network user ID on multiple top-level domains. Both those developments should happen in the next 3 months. There's the best post I've read on ITP is by Simo Ahava. The link's in the presentation. I'm hoping we share the presentation around. That not only gives a lot of technical detail about ITP 2.1, but also Simo works through the different hacks that are available to users on any analytics system to work around them. So I've concentrated on the straightforward things that we enable, but there's a more expanded list that you can find in Simo's post. So those are all the things that I wanted to cover. But let's talk about let's turn over to questions, please.
Yeah, so feel free to use the chat window or the Q&A button. But yeah, it would be great to hear if there are any more questions, reflections, thoughts about some of the content. We'll give it a minute or so. It's a lot to take in. And yeah, like Yali said, we'll be making the recording of this webinar available. I know a few of you had colleagues that wanted to join. It's challenging finding the right time slot for our global customer base. So we'll be sharing it afterwards, and we can also share the slides as well. And if there's nothing that comes to mind right now, but there's kind of a few things sinking in, then you can always reach out to us. I think it's interesting to point out actually that the ad block feature that Yali spoke about that's on our roadmap, that's kind of directly from a suggestion with one of our customers and kind of working through that with them. So on this stuff, we're really open to learn and hear from you as well, and feed that into our product roadmap.
I've got a question for all the attendees, if there are none coming the other.
We've got one, Yali.
Okay. Question.
I believe John Willender from Apple mentioned local storage also being purged in some cases. Are you familiar with that scenario?
No, I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with that scenario, I'm afraid. One of the challenges, one of the things we're going to have to closely monitor are what are the next steps that Apple are going to take on ITP. So is this the start of? Yeah, is this the last time? Is this the last measure Apple take to prevent tracking, or is this going to become a regular feature, and every 3 months we're going to have to think about rolling out new features to enable our users to to keep doing fair tracking.
And we've got another one. So our company is very focused on user tracking across multiple third-party domains for the purpose of advertising attribution. One of the bugbears our clients have is around tackling the walled gardens, in particular YouTube video advertising. We've recently been pushed towards leveraging Google Ads Data Hub, which is taking us in a direction where we have to blend cookie tracking data with pixel-less tracking data. Is this something coming up with more of your customers?
Yes, I think it is. So more and more platforms that are important for companies running Snowplow to track users in are places where they can't track directly, so they're having to rely on the owners of those walled gardens to provide data. And so I think that the two really interesting providers there are Facebook and Google. So Facebook have always been pretty locked down in terms of the visibility that they give people using companies using their platform to see how their users are interacting with their content on Facebook. Google historically has been better, so they've let us integrate our Snowplow tracking in AMP. So you can track users in AMP directly yourselves via Snowplow rather than relying on Google. But YouTube is going a different direction. So that's not ideal, and I don't think there's anything we or YouTube customers can do to stop that. The owners of those walled gardens have too much market power, really.
But you're not alone.
You're definitely not alone.
Definitely not alone, I think, if that's one thing to take from it. Perfect. I think, Yali, we haven't had another question come in just yet, but I think you mentioned that you had a question you would like to ask. People could respond in the chat. Yeah.
I was just curious to know if people had, because ITP has been slowly rolling out for a few weeks. ITP 2.1 has been slowly rolling out for a few weeks, and people have already seen a big impact from that update, and have already taken measures to mitigate those effects. Two questions, really.
Yeah, so if anyone has anything they would like or be interested to share in the chat, then that would be really useful. But yeah, as Yali said, this might be something that we see evolving more and have more questions about over time. Oh, that's interesting.
That's encouraging, Gabor.
I feel like most customers that I've been to meet face to face recently have kind of ended up in a debate about the materiality of Safari customers and the value of that segment and how big it is. So I guess that's something that we'll see come out of this and get an understanding of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, that the Firefox guys were planning to follow suit. So I suspect the segment of users that this affects will get quite large. But it's super interesting, Gabor, that you've not seen the impact so far. That's, yeah, don't get too excited. That's quite encouraging.
I think we've got another question coming in, Yali. So a question on ITP versus network user ID. So let's say I have site A and site B, where, sorry, just a little bit of background noise here, where user interacted heavily with site A. Only much later, the user pays a visit to site B. Then it seems that site B has been regarded as a third party all along. then how would setting network user ID on multiple top-level domains prevent ITP from blocking it if there was no meaningful traffic on the other domains?
That's a great question. So so in the new world where the collector supports setting the cookie on different top-level domains, the user visits site A, the collector sees the user on site A, sets a cookie on a.com, for example, and the user's tracked that way via that cookie ID. When, after a period of time, the user goes to site B, the collector sees the user on site B. The collector, I think, would end up setting a different cookie value on site B on a different cookie domain. So it wouldn't end up being the same identifier. But because that cookie is set on the same top-level domain, it's a first-party cookie in both cases. So with this proposed functionality, the network user ID would be a first-party cookie on both domains, but it wouldn't be a consistent. But because of that, it wouldn't be the same ID across both. So you wouldn't be able to tell from the cookie ID that this was the same user, but you would be able to reliably track the anonymous user within each of the two domains. You just have to find some other way of stitching them together.
Great. So I don't think we've had any more questions come in, but I think there's been some really, really interesting ones. So thank you so much for your engagement and probably asking questions that a lot of people are going to be thinking about. So yeah, just to reiterate, I'll share all this stuff afterwards, but we're really excited to work with you and continue to kind of have this dialogue, continue to strategize together on how to best collect data with kind of the landscape that we're operating in. So please get in touch with me, Yali, send a ticket to support. You know, we're really, really keen to continue this dialogue, and thank you so much for attending the webinar today, and thank you, Yali, for giving up your time and speaking to our customers.
No, my pleasure. Thanks everybody for attending. It's been really nice talking to you. I'm just sorry, sorry to not hear your voices. But, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Bye.